Phone's off. So, my name is John Mark Dugan. I'm actually exiled to Russia. Yeah. So, I used to be a police officer in America, and now I'm here. So, um, I've been watching your coverage of Donbass, and actually, I was watching it even before I went for the first time. And you've really been consistently right. And I'm curious to know how it is that you can be so correct in spite of what the media tells you, because everything it seems that the mainstream media is saying is an absolute farce.
Well, I think first of all, we have to talk about approaches. The purpose of the mainstream media, we now know, thanks to the admissions of the U.S. government, is to serve as a mouthpiece of disinformation. The mainstream media's job is not to provide fact-based proof or truth, but rather to provide data that has been released by the United States government, the British government, the Ukrainian government, for the sole purpose of shaping a narrative. So
Yeah.
the mainstream media is trying to convince people about a falsified narrative.
Okay.
I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I don't have I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm an American. I'm not Russian. I'm not Ukrainian. I'm an analyst, and I thank you for your kind words, but I've gotten a lot wrong. But I've gotten it wrong not because my intent is to deceive. I've gotten it wrong because I assemble a limited data set, and I try to connect the dots and project, what future events will be. And, projecting the future is always a difficult analytical task, even if you have 100% certainty of all the data, because there's just so many moving parts. You can't possibly be 100% correct all the time. So I've been wrong on some things. I thought that, for instance, this war would not last as long. I thought the Russians would be more successful in their initial combat operations against the Ukrainian military. It happened to be an assessment that was shared by General Mark Milley, by William Burns, the director of the CIA, and others. We all made the same mistake, not understanding that Russia wasn't going to war against Ukraine. My assessment was premised on Russia going to war against Ukraine, not carrying out this limited, self-limiting special military operation. And it's taken me and others some time, because even though Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership has framed the special military operation politically, from a military operational standpoint, the Russians have not done a good job of describing to the layperson exactly what a special military operation is. We've been compelled to assess from long distance, limited facts, try to prioritize the fact set to what we think the Russians are saying, and come up with a definition of what the special military operation is. It's taken me a little bit of time to do that. I think I've gotten it right. And once I recalibrated my military analytical modeling that takes place between the left earlobe and the right earlobe, I think I've been much more accurate in my predictions. Look, at the end of the day, factors like PK, probability of kill, don't change. Whether you're pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian, every time somebody pulls a lanyard on an artillery piece, there's a mathematical formula attached to the probability of kill. So you need a lot of lanyards pulled with specific intelligence, specific combinations of fusing shell types, the terrain, etc. And then from that, you can pretty much predict what casualty rates are going to be. And one of the things that I think I've been pretty good at is saying straight up that the Ukrainians are suffering far more losses on the battlefield than Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, people can point to the early days of the special military operation where Russian columns were ambushed, where Russia suffered losses, but these are one-ofs. These aren't sustainable or sustained victories on part of Ukraine. It was part of the miscalculation made by Russia early on to push forward without adequately securing flanks in the rear under the assumption that the Ukrainians wouldn't resist to the level that they actually ended up resisting. But once we got past phase one, we moved into phase two. I think I've been pretty dead on because, again, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I don't have an agenda. My job isn't to convince people that, that Russia is going to win or that Ukraine is going to lose. My job is to take a look at the facts and say Russia's right now, the data set, points to Russia winning on the battlefield for this reason, that reason, this reason, that reason. I was one of the first people. In fact, I was attacked very, very aggressively by many people when in May, I said, look, the provision of tens of billions of dollars of NATO equipment is a game-changing event that's going to fundamentally change the reality on the battlefield. I was one of the first people to say that Russia has insufficient resources to the task. That if you start a special military operation with 200,000 men and the premises you made in creating this force didn't pan out and you're now engaged in a broad-based war of attrition against an enemy that outnumbers you 3-1, you're going to have problems. And the problems become magnified when that enemy, despite being ground down by your forces because of your artillery advantage, has been reinforced dramatically. And this is what led to, the battles in Kharkov in September, the battles in Kherson in October, where Russia was forced to withdraw from significant territories. But I'm also, I said that it was a Russian withdrawal, not a Russian retreat. That the Russians hadn't been defeated. Russia simply recognized that it was in a disadvantaged situation and pulled back. Did Russia suffer losses? Yes, but Ukraine suffered even more losses, and that's something I pointed out. And basically, my calculations are derived from two basic concepts, what I call a burn rate and what I call a replenishment rate. And the burn rate is the casualty rate, the degree to which a respective military force suffers casualties, both manpower and equipment. If you have a high burn rate, you're suffering high casualties. If you have a low burn rate, it's lower. We know that the Russians are, have a casualty ratio advantage of anywhere from 1-5 to 1-10, depending where you are in the battlefield. The bottom line is Russia's killing more Ukrainians than the Ukrainians are killing Russians. We also know that the Ukrainian replenishment rate is significantly reduced. Why else are they begging for more equipment from the West? It's because the equipment that they brought in has largely been consumed in combat operations against the Russians. The Russians, meanwhile, are finishing up the final preparations of the last of the 300,000 partially mobilized reservists. Their replenishment rate is huge. So with a small burn rate, big replenishment rate, taking on a huge burn rate, small replenishment rate, basic military math dictates that this is advantage Russia. Then you link into that the overall conditions under which these armies are fighting. Russia is fighting with a line leading back to a nation that is fundamentally intact, politically, economically, socially. The Russian leadership has tremendous support, base of support amongst the Russian people. The Russian economy is not only functioning for the civilians, but has been successfully transitioned into a wartime economy from a defense industry standpoint, where the defense industries are churning out military equipment. I don't see any disadvantages from the socioeconomic political foundation upon which the Russian military operation is based. We come to Ukraine and we can't say the same thing. The Ukrainian economy is in tatters. Fact is, if it weren't for the injection of tens of billions of dollars of direct financial assistance to Ukraine, their economy would collapse instantaneously. even with this assistance, their energy grid is devastated. I don't know what level they're operating at now, 30%, 40%, in some places less than that, maybe in some places more than that. But as the Russians continue to degrade the energy grid, the Ukrainians lack the ability to reconstitute it. And this further degrades not only the economy of Ukraine, but the society of Ukraine.
The morale is shot there.
Yeah, it's shot. And so that when a society has poor morale, it translates into a lack of support. And we see Zelensky right now engaged in internal political conflicts with his commander of his armed forces, Zaluzhny. There's talk about Zaluzhny becoming a political opponent to Zelensky in the upcoming elections. We see other players, Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, throwing his hat in the ring. There's other players out there as well. So there's a lot of infighting, political intrigue taking place that doesn't exist on the Russian side. And then you have, of course, the fact that the Ukrainian military is devastated. There's a lack of morale there. And the equipment they are being provided is being provided haphazardly. They're not prepared to maintain it. They're not trained to operate it. And it pretty much isn't designed to transform the battlefield to their advantage. So when you put all these factors in, it's not hard to say from a big picture, not only is Russia winning, but Russia is positioned to win, to accomplish its objectives of demilitarization, denazification. Now, having said all that, none of this is going to be easy, and it's not going to be cheap. I mean, we can sit here and talk about casualty ratios. You know, they've been throwing out some figures that, you know, in the Bakhmut, Soledar area region, the Ukrainians are suffering 800, 1,000, or even more casualties a day. All right, that's a lot. But remember this, if the casualty ratio is 1 to 10, and you're suffering 800 casualties a day, that means the Russians are suffering 80 casualties a day. And that means in a week, Russia's suffering, you know, nearly 600 casualties in a week. I don't know what percentage of those are dead and wounded, but if it's 600 casualties in a week, that means 150 to 200 dead. All right, that's a lot, a week. So, you know, we can't sit here and just because I've painted this so-called rosy picture that has Russia winning, pretend that Russia isn't suffering losses, that this isn't expensive for Russia, this isn't hurtful for Russia. But the Russian nation, because it has a viable economy, an economy that has voluntarily and willingly transitioned into a wartime footing for defense industry, because the nation has rallied behind its political leader, I think Russia is positioned to absorb these casualties and move on without any hesitation. Whereas Ukraine, the more the reality comes out about the casualty levels, I think the less support is going to exist. Many Ukrainians are fleeing the country. Many Ukrainians are just fighting for basic survival. So I just think, again, it's advantage Russia, but it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be cheap. I don't want anybody to think that I'm somehow predicting a simple, easy victory for Russia. There's nothing.
It's not simple or easy. It's absolutely not.
Yeah.
So, and it's been very difficult. You know, just being over there, just seeing what's happening. Not just for the military, but the civilians in those areas too. You know, it's interesting. I just interviewed one of the, when you talked about disenfranchised, I guess, commanders in Zelensky's army. I just interviewed one not too long ago. I just posted the interview yesterday. One of some, excuse me, Zelensky's top commanders, who basically said that he was taking, that they have this huge narcotics operation, right? They are making, I think he said $600,000 or $900,000 per day from the troops, from Ukrainian troops selling these narcotics, being manufactured in Ukraine to the troops to keep their morale up. And that they're brokering a lot of these weapons, like javelins, through Saudi Arabia. And, or was it Dubai? Well, anyways, you have to watch the interview. It was one of the two. And I was really blown away by these. I mean, I knew there was a lot of corruption going on there, but I had no idea, the amount. And I think once people start seeing this in Ukraine, once this information starts getting out, not just Ukraine, but in America, it's going to change a lot of minds about this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, one, congratulations on your reporting, and two, um, you know, none of this is secret. I mean, we've known for a long time Ukraine is a cesspool of corruption.
Sure.
You know, I was in Kiev in November of 1997 with the
Hmm.
United Nations Special Commission. I went there together with the Israelis. In fact, they helped broker this meeting with the National Security Council of Kuchma. And I met with the head of the SBU, Kuchma's people, et cetera, to try and talk them into not allowing these rogue arms dealers to break up former Soviet weapons production capabilities and sell them to the Iraqis,
Hmm.
especially ballistic missiles, et cetera. Um, and what I found is that this is just everybody was greasing everybody's pockets. That this arms dealer had already paid off the right people. That I wasn't going to have any success. In fact, I had to leave because there was concern that if I pushed this point, that one of the competing factions would in fact kill me. That's how lawless Ukraine was at the time. Um, but the one thing that came clear is even in 1997, the Ukrainians were coming up and saying, if we help you, will you put a good word in for us with the United States about NATO? We want to be NATO members. If we help
Hmm.
you, if so, it was conditional. If we
Sure.
help you, we don't want to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. We're a United Nations member and we've agreed to support, but we might help you, but you have to give us something, NATO membership. And I just left totally disgusted with what the reality of Kiev. Now, you know, I can't say that I know for a fact that from that point on that Ukraine continued that trajectory of corruption, but all the information I've um, been able to receive suggests that that is indeed the case. It's one of the most corrupt nations on the planet. Um,
Hmm.
so it should come as no surprise, therefore, when you pour in tens of billions of dollars of materiel that has a value. And remember, the Ukrainians aren't um, slow to the show, so to speak, about arms dealing. They've been doing illegal arms deals. That's why I was in Ukraine to begin with, because of
Yeah,
the
sure.
illegal arms trade that was going on out of Ukraine. They've been doing it for a long time. They're experts at it. They're experts at getting small arms and light munitions around the world to people who will pay for it. So when we provide them with some of the most modern small light weaponry, like the Javelin missile, the NLAW, the Carl Gustav, any machine guns, mines, ammunition, grenades, etc. Um, all of this is inherently transportable in the back of a car, um, and there's no accountability. We just
Hmm.
give it to them. Do we
Yeah.
suddenly think that the Ukrainians, at a flip of the switch, stopped being the most corrupt people on the planet and started becoming upright citizens who care about their country, care about doing the right thing, and will be honorable when you hand them millions of dollars, billions of dollars worth of merchandise? Or will they revert to form and say, "Hey, let's take some of this over here"? You know, it's like the old in the old days when a box of Nike shoes would show up in New Jersey, be put into a truck and start to make its way to New York City. Invariably, the lock broke, the thing went up, some boxes fell off the truck, and we
Of the
just
truck.
know
Yeah,
what
yeah, yeah.
happened. I arrived and this was open and we lost 20%, but I still have enough shoes here. Um, well, that's what happened here. A lot of javelins and in-laws fell off the truck, so to speak, and were sold on in a black market system that the Ukrainians are already plugged into because they invented it.
Yeah, I'm
There's a
sure.
reason why the Ukrainians were able to smuggle explosives out of Odessa in a grain shipment. It's not as though that led to, of course, the attack on the Crimea Bridge. It's not as though one day the Ukrainians said, oh, we could do this. They've been doing it. This is how they operate. The entire system of Ukraine is geared towards black marketeering, under the table, illegal smuggling operations, to avoid taxation, to avoid accountability, et cetera. And so when Rand Paul, the U.S. Senator from Kentucky, stood up in May and said, hey, before we give them $45 billion, why don't we have an inspector general who can account for all of this? And he was shouted down. No, the consequences are what we're seeing today. These weapons are showing up in Europe, in Africa, and I'm sure they're going to show up elsewhere in the hands of people that shouldn't have these weapons. But now they do.
Yeah. Poland and Germany too, by the way. Oh, you said Europe. Yeah. Well, I see, I see one of the major problems with the upcoming battle is the river, the Dnieper River. And how I keep thinking, look, I was in the Marine Corps.
Semper Fi.
Oh, thanks. But I don't see any strategy that Russia is going to have that they're going to be able to efficiently move troops and tanks across this river unless they go up through Belarus. And so I kind of want to ask your opinion on that.
Well, I mean, the Russians, have inherited certain doctrinal, mechanisms from the Soviets. And I can say this, that the Soviets, in order to drive from the border between East Germany and West Germany and drive through to the Rhine River and beyond if necessary, would have to cross a number of river obstacles. And so they have units that are dedicated into putting, pontoons down, laying bridges rapidly, crossing the bridges, et cetera. One of the reasons why we didn't, we saw some difficulty with this in the early stages of the SMO, and later on, even in the summer, we saw that the Russians were having trouble north of Kharkiv about river crossings, et cetera, because of insufficient tasks. I mean, you can't cross a river unless you dominate the opposing bank with artillery and firepower. If you don't have the ability to suppress the enemy, and you try to cross a river, the enemy is going to hit your concentrated forces with artillery and inflict a lot of casualties, which is what the Ukrainians did.
Right.
So it's not that the Russians don't have the ability to cross rivers. They do. They can actually better than any army on the planet. What they needed was the resources available to support a river crossing, to build that bridgehead and exploit that bridgehead and push in. And now with the mobilization of the 300,000, I believe they have those capabilities. So I think if and when the Russians decide to begin the major offensive, I think we're going to see a completely different kind of warfare than what we've seen before. Because it's hard to have doctrinal warfare when you don't have the resources sufficient. Remember, the Russians were fighting on a frontage of greater than 1,500 kilometers.
Yeah, it's massive, absolutely massive.
And when you have 200,000 troops committed, let's say you could throw in an additional 100,000 volunteers and another 40, 50,000 people from the Donbass militias, et cetera. But the bottom line is you're talking 300 men per kilometer, but now you have to factor in logistics depth because not everybody's a trigger puller. There's a lot of communications people there, logistics people there, truck drivers, cooks, bakers, candlestick makers. So a lot of that combat force is actually not on the front line, but in the rear area. You may only have 120,000 troops capable of manning the front line positions. So now it's 120 guys per kilometer. But now when you throw in depth, concentrations, et cetera, there's going to be portions of the battlefield where you have 30 to 50 guys covering a kilometer.
Right.
And that doesn't work. Now, the only way it does work is if you build a strong point, have a defense in depth, and then you can cover the cauldron that's created with firepower. So the enemy comes in, hits your strong point, diverts into a cauldron, is checked by another defense in depth and then pounded into submission by Russian artillery. But the Russians didn't have the forces necessary to build that defense. Instead, they had big gaps, and the Ukrainians were able to penetrate in depth and all that stuff. And so there's been a perception created that the Russians aren't as capable as they need to be to carry out the kind of operations necessary to defeat the Ukrainians. My feeling is that the Russians have to prove themselves. I mean, that's clear. I can't wish this upon them. I can't, say it's automatic. Russia's going to have to do it themselves. But I have respect for the Russian generals, just like I have respect for the Ukrainian officers. They're professionals. They know what their doctrine is. They know what's required. And they know what the challenges are. So I can't imagine Russia mobilizing 300,000 reservists, mobilizing an additional 120 plus thousand volunteers, creating combat units and not thinking how you're going to use them.
Yeah, sure.
We need bridge crossing. We need more artillery. We need drones in depth. All this. I just believe that Russia is prepared for the task it's getting ready to undertake. If they're not, then Russia's not going to win. That's as simple as that. You can say what you want about the collective West / Ukrainian force that's in that's fighting against the Russians. We can criticize the ideology of many of these people, the neo-Nazi ideology, which is odious and hateful. But the bottom line is, the Waffen-SS espoused a odious, hateful ideology as well. But if you slipped up in front of them on the battlefield, they'd smack you down.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the Ukrainians, if the Russians make a mistake, provide opportunities, the Ukrainians will smack them down. The Ukrainians aren't just capable fighters, but they're being given world-class intelligence support from the United States, world-class communication support, world-class planning support, world-class logistics support. This is a NATO army that Russia's fighting.
Absolutely.
Russia needs to treat it with respect, because if you make a mistake, this NATO army will kick your butt.
Yeah. Yeah, you're 100% right. And Anastasia?
So it's my turn, yes. My topic is a bit different. Scott, I would like to ask you about the previous events in Brazil. Maybe you can share what attitude the Americans have towards what is happening in Brazil. Do they support these protests? Maybe you can share your own opinion about it.
Well, I mean, there's striking parallels between what happened on Sunday in Brazil, where a crowd of many tens of thousands took over. I think it's called the Three Powers Square, where the Brazilian Supreme Court, the residency of the presidency, and Congress are contained in the capital city of Brasilia. A huge crowd of pro Bolsonaro, the former president, supporters came in, took it over in protest. They feel that the election that was carried out last year was fraudulent, and that the current president, Lula, should not have been sworn in. They've been protesting, thousands of them, outside of the army headquarters outside of Brasilia, demanding that the army intervene and stop an illegal inauguration. The army did no such thing. And so my understanding is that they launched this riot, this protest, this demonstration in hopes that the army would rally around them and overthrow the Lula government and bring Bolsonaro back in. There are many parallels between them and the pro-Trump crowds that took over the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of 2021. Both sides believe that an election was fraudulent. Both sides believe that the president that was sworn in was an illegitimate president, and both sides believe somehow by putting forward this demonstration of public outrage that others would rally to their cause. They were both wrong. The January 6th demonstrations, riot, insurrection, whatever term you want to apply to it, failed to accomplish its task, and the crowd either voluntarily dispersed or were physically dispersed by law enforcement, backed up by limited mobilized military capabilities. In Brazil, while it appears that local police stepped aside and didn't stop these demonstrations, that ultimately at the end of the day, when the president Lula asked the military to intervene, they did so decisively and they broke up the demonstrations. The problem here in both cases is populism. Anybody who studies democracy and the concept of democratic governance, there's one basic truth, is that a government can only succeed if the people allow it to succeed. There has to be a will amongst the people to be governed, which means the government has to have trust of the population. Both in the United States and in Brazil, significant percentages of the population have lost faith with the government. They've lost faith that the processes of governance are legitimate. They believe that there are powers out there that are manipulating these processes to generate an outcome that keeps a certain faction in power and denies the will of the people, so to speak. I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying what they believe. And this exists. And so even though the demonstrations have been quashed in the United States and have been quashed in Brazil, it doesn't change the fact that in both countries, there's significant percentages of the people that still view the election as fraudulent. It doesn't matter that, facts haven't been brought before a court of law that have been cognizable. There was a study done early on by, I forget who did it. I think James Baker was involved in it, but it was basically a study about the viability of mail-in ballots. And one of the conclusions that was reached was it doesn't matter if mail-in ballots work. If people can perceive that there's the potential for fraud, the perception of the potential for fraud is the greatest threat, because that's what drives people. People aren't driven necessarily by reality; they're driven by perceptions. And right now in the United States, for right or for wrong, it doesn't matter. There is a significant percentage of the population that perceives the electoral process as fraudulent, as being gamed against them. And that exists in Brazil as well. There's a significant percentage of Brazilians who feel that the election system is geared against them, prejudiced against them, and they feel defrauded. And the question is, how do you go forward on this? Most of the times in democracies, when you have a social problem, a societal problem, in the United States, we've struggled with this on civil rights, on basic issues. We resolve it at the polls. We let competing parties pitch their ideas, etc., to the people through whatever vehicle they can, and the people vote. They vote in representatives who hopefully represent their ideals and will defend their ideals in the legislature, in the Senate, etc. And we get societal change that way. But right now we have people that don't have trust in the system. They don't believe that will work. They believe that no matter what they do at the poll, the system will always be against them, will always be opposed to them. So they've lost faith in one of the fundamental precepts of what makes American democracy, or in the case of Brazil, Brazilian democracy, viable. That is the connection between the will of the people and the government through an election process. I don't know how we fix that. That's one of the things that we're doing, because the people that are trying to fix it, who claim to be trying to fix it, are the very people that people don't trust anymore. So, I think we're in a situation where both American and Brazilian democracy is fundamentally broken. And I don't know what the solution is.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. So.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes left. John, do you have any questions? I have one more.
No, go ahead.
Okay, maybe it can be just a little of comments, but still, it seems just an illustration of double standards in the USA. Just remember Zuckerberg's policy towards protests in Russia, as well as calls to kill Russians. Let's mention Meta was recognized as extremist organization in Russia for such calls. So the question is, what is the real reason, for your opinion, Facebook delete posts related to the process in Brazil?
Well, we're getting to the bottom of that. I don't know the real reason because it's done internally, and Facebook's not a public institution. There's no accountability. It's a private organization that can pretty much do anything it wants to internally. We're finding now that Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, we're finding out the collusion that took place between the Twitter management and the U.S. government and law enforcement to basically violate First Amendment protections of the American public, of the participants, to shape perception by emphasizing certain tweets and deplatforming other tweets. I myself was a victim of that, being banned from Twitter for some time. And in Facebook, we have yet to have the veil put across. Maybe Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald will eventually turn their sights on Facebook and seek access to this information. But this is one of the problems when you have companies like Facebook and Twitter, et cetera. There is no transparency, and because it's rules based, not law based, they can do anything they want. But the First Amendment rights of American citizens, when we talk about digital public platforms, have to be protected. And this is a place that even the Supreme Court has acknowledged case law needs to be updated. Because we live in a digital reality where Twitter and Facebook can't be seen as purely private enterprises. It is indeed a public space, and therefore free speech must be protected in these public spaces. And you can't have an internal dynamic within Facebook that nobody knows what's happening, decide which post to delete, which post to emphasize, et cetera, because there's not free speech. That's the opposite of free speech.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Well, thank you.
Look, so on a side note, you can stop the recording if you want. On a side note, I have some stuff that I